Picture this. Constantinople, 1453. The mighty walls that protected the Byzantine Empire for 1,000 years are crumbling under Ottoman cannons. But while history remembers the fall of an empire, it deliberately forgets what happened next. In the smoke and rubble, as Byzantine warriors lay dying in the streets, their wives are about to discover that death would have been a mercy. What if I told you that the Ottoman Empire perfected a system of psychological destruction so calculated, methodical, that it would make medieval torture chambers seem humane by comparison? Imagine being torn from your children, told they were dead, only to learn years later they were alive but transformed into instruments of the very empire that destroyed your life. This isn't fiction. This is documented history, preserved in Ottoman archives that historians refused to fully translate for centuries. The screams that echoed through conquered cities weren't just from battle. They were from mothers watching their children being sorted like livestock, from wives seeing their husbands' killers become their new masters, from women discovering that their fate was to become living monuments to defeat. What the Ottomans did to these women wasn't random brutality. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly efficient. They had manuals. They had quotas. They had specialists trained in breaking the human spirit. And they kept meticulous records of every shattered life. But here's what will haunt you. These women weren't just victims of war. They were weapons. Living, breathing weapons designed to prevent rebellion, to demonstrate power, and to ensure that no conquered people would ever dare resist Ottoman rule again. Their suffering was calculated to echo through generations, creating ripples of trauma that would last centuries. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer territories. They conquered bloodlines, identities, and souls. And they did it with the cold precision of an industrial machine. The year is 1461. The Ottoman Empire stretches across 3 continents, its red banners casting shadows over lands that once knew different gods, different kings, different lives. This is an empire built not just on military might, but on something far more sinister: the complete psychological domination of conquered peoples. While European chroniclers write of Ottoman military tactics and architectural marvels, they deliberately omit the darkest chapter of Ottoman conquest. Perhaps because it was too horrifying to comprehend. Perhaps because it implicated their own diplomatic relationships with the empire. Or perhaps because acknowledging it would mean admitting that civilization itself had failed. In the Ottoman administrative archives in Istanbul, documents written in Ottoman Turkish detail what they called population processing. These aren't the ravings of enemies trying to demonize the empire. These are the Ottomans' own records, their own admissions, their own instruction manuals for systematic human destruction. The empire that gave us magnificent mosques and revolutionary administrative systems also gave us something else: a blueprint for breaking human beings that would influence authoritarian regimes for centuries to come. What makes this story particularly chilling is how it was hidden in plain sight. Ottoman bureaucrats documented everything with the same detached efficiency they used for tax collection. A report from the Weaponization, governor of Bosnia in 1463 reads, "The separation protocols have been implemented as instructed. 43 noble wives processed this month. Compliance rates improving. Processed. Not captured. Not imprisoned. Processed. Like grain through a mill. Like ore through a furnace." These women had become raw materials in the empire's machine of conquest. But why did historians bury this truth for so long? Why are we only now beginning to understand the full scope of what happened? The answer lies in the very nature of trauma itself. Some horrors are so profound that they create silence not just in their victims, but in history itself. The women who survived couldn't speak of what happened to them. Their children, products of forced unions, lived in denial, and the empire itself had every reason to let these practices fade into shadow, once European diplomatic pressure made them politically inconvenient. Yet the evidence survives, in hidden letters discovered in demolished walls, encoded, Ottoman documents recently decrypted, in the generational trauma that echoes through families across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Middle East. This is the story they didn't want you to know. The story of how an empire weaponized human suffering with such precision that its victims often couldn't even name what had been done to them. The Ottoman Empire's treatment of defeated warriors' wives began the moment a city's walls were breached. But to understand the full horror, we must first understand the system that created it. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of battle. This was policy. Official, documented, refined policy that had been perfected over centuries of conquest. The Ottomans had learned something that would horrify even the most hardened military strategists. Breaking bodies was temporary, but breaking minds could last forever. When Ottoman forces conquered a city, they arrived with lists, not just of military targets or strategic resources, but of families. They then knew the names of noble wives, the ages of their children, the structure of their households. Ottoman intelligence networks had mapped the human terrain as carefully as they had mapped the physical fortifications. The moment the gates fell, specialized units moved through the city with terrifying precision. These weren't regular soldiers. They were what Ottoman documents call social engineers, experts in human categorization and psychological manipulation. The process began with immediate separation. Wives were torn from their dying or captured husbands within hours of conquest. But this separation was just the beginning of a carefully orchestrated psychological assault. Ottoman records from the conquest of Trebizond in 1461 describe the scene with chilling bureaucratic detail. The women of defeated commanders assembled in the main square. Categories established according to age, health, and reproductive potential. Children under 10 removed for devshirme consideration. Mothers informed of executions to ensure immediate psychological compliance. Devshirme, the blood tax, the system by which Christian children were taken, converted, and transformed into Ottoman soldiers and administrators. But here's what the fears. Sanitized histories don't tell you. Mothers were deliberately told their children had been killed. This lie served multiple purposes. It broke maternal bonds immediately. It prevented mothers from attempting rescue. And most cruelly, it created a psychological void that the Ottoman system would later exploit with devastating effect. The women were then subjected to what Ottoman documents call identity erasure. Their names were replaced with numbers. Their clothing, jewelry, and personal belongings were confiscated and destroyed. Even their hair was sometimes cut in specific patterns that marked them as conquered. This wasn't just humiliation. It was the systematic destruction of every anchor to their previous identity. A woman who had been Maria, wife of a Byzantine commander, mother of 3, became simply Trebizond 1461, female 47. Her entire existence reduced to a location, a date, and a number. But the true genius of Ottoman psychological warfare was in what came next. These women weren't simply enslaved or executed. They were transformed through a process so methodical that Ottoman administrators wrote training manuals about it. These women were rebuilt as living weapons against their own people. The process had phases. First, isolation. Women were kept separate from anyone who knew their former identity. Second, disorientation. They were moved constantly never allowed to form new bonds or establish routines. Third, false hope. Periodically, they would be told their children might be alive, but only if they cooperated fully. This cooperation meant providing information about resistance networks, identifying other noble families, and most horrifically, participating in the processing of newly conquered women. Dot. The psychological sophistication of this system reveals itself in the Ottoman archives. A document from 1478 describes optimal breaking periods for different categories of women. Noble wives required different techniques than merchant wives. Mothers of multiple children responded to different pressures than childless women. The Ottomans had transformed human suffering into a science. One of the most disturbing aspects was the use of what they called maternal reconstruction. Women who had been told their children were dead would be forced to care for Ottoman children, often the children of the very soldiers who had conquered their cities. They had to nurse these babies, sing them lullabies, and show affection, all while being reminded daily that their own children were gone. But here's the twisted detail that Ottoman records reveal. Many of these women were actually caring for their own children, who had been processed through the Devshirme system and no longer recognized their mothers. Imagine the agony of singing your child to sleep, knowing they don't remember you, knowing they've been transformed into an instrument of the empire that destroyed your world. The forced marriages were perhaps the cruelest element of all. These weren't just political arrangements. They were psychological torture disguised as domestic life. Women were married to men who had participated in killing their husbands, sometimes the very men who had struck the fatal blow. Ottoman legal documents show these marriages were carefully orchestrated. The new husbands were given specific instructions on how to break their wives' remaining resistance. They were to require the women to cook traditional dishes from their homeland, but serve them to Ottoman guests who would mock the conquered culture. They were to demand the women maintain Ottoman households, while forbidding any expression of their original identity. A surviving letter hidden in a wall in Serbia, discovered during renovations in 1962, provides a rare, first-person account. A woman writes, "My husband's killer sleeps beside me. He demands I call him beloved. He has given me 2 sons, and I love them with all my broken heart. But they will never know their mother was once free. They will never know their mother had another name. They will never know their father was a hero who died defending our walls. They know only that their mother is a conquered thing, and their father is a conqueror. This is how empires truly win. Not by killing us, but by making us complicit in our own erasure." But the Ottoman system went even deeper. They understood that trauma could be inherited, passed down through generations like a poisoned heirloom. The children born from these forced unions were raised in a carefully controlled environment of confusion and shame. They were taught to be proud Ottomans while simultaneously being reminded that their mothers were conquered people. These children often developed what Ottoman physicians described in their medical texts as inherited melancholy, what we would now recognize as generational trauma. The scale of this system is staggering. Ottoman tax records and administrative documents suggest that over the course of 4 centuries, hundreds of thousands of women were processed through this system. Each conquest followed the same pattern, refined and perfected with terrifying efficiency. By the height of the empire, they had created what amounted to a human processing industry, complete with quotas, quality controls, and performance metrics. A report from the governor of Bosnia in 1521 boasts, "This quarter's processing has exceeded expectations. 47 noble wives successfully reconstructed. Resistance rates down to less than 3%. The new techniques for maternal bond disruption show particular promise." This wasn't the language of warfare. This was the language of industrial production, applied to human souls. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation comes from recently translated documents that suggest the Ottomans were conducting what we would now recognize as psychological experiments. They documented which techniques produced the fastest identity dissolution. They tested different combinations of isolation, false hope, and forced collaboration. They even studied the children born from forced marriages, tracking their loyalty to the empire across generations. This wasn't just conquest. It was the systematic study of how to destroy and rebuild human beings. The Ottoman administrators who oversaw this system weren't hidden in shadows. They were respected officials who received bonuses based on their effectiveness. A successful processor could rise through the ranks of the imperial bureaucracy. Some even wrote treatises on their methods, sharing best practices across the empire. One such manual, discovered in the Ottoman archives in 2019, contains a chilling section on what the author calls the art of sustainable despair, keeping victims in a state of psychological collapse without pushing them to complete breakdown, thereby maintaining their usefulness to the empire. What happened in the harems adds another layer to this horror. The word harem conjures images of exotic luxury, but for the wives of defeated warriors, it was a different kind of prison entirely. These women weren't the pampered concubines of Ottoman fantasy. They were psychological test subjects, their every response documented and analyzed. The harem wasn't just a place of seclusion. It was a laboratory for human transformation. The women who entered the imperial harem as spoils of war faced a particularly insidious form of psychological manipulation. They were given new names, taught Turkish, and instructed in Islamic practices. But, unlike voluntary converts who might find genuine faith, these women were forced to perform religious rituals while being reminded daily that they were conquered infidels. They had to pray to Allah while knowing their husbands had died defending Christ. They had to thank the Sultan for his mercy while knowing he had ordered their family's destruction. The hierarchy within the harem was deliberately designed to pit women against each other. Conquered wives could improve their position only by demonstrating complete loyalty to the empire, often by informing on other women who showed signs of resistance or grief. This created an environment where no one could be trusted, where every conversation might be reported, where even tears had to be hidden. The isolation wasn't just physical. It was complete social and emotional quarantine. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The Ottoman system recognized that some women would resist despite everything. For these women, they had special protocols. Documents describe intensive reconstruction programs that sound more like psychological torture than anything else. Women who refused to cooperate were subjected to elaborate scenarios designed to break their will. They might be told their children were alive and about to be executed unless they complied. They might be shown forged letters suggesting their families had betrayed them. They might be forced to watch as other resistant women were punished, knowing they were next unless they surrendered. The Ottoman Empire's treatment of defeated warriors' wives created ripples that extended far beyond individual victims. Entire regions were psychologically scarred in ways that would influence their cultures for centuries. The Balkans, Anatolia, the Arab provinces, all bore the invisible wounds of this systematic trauma. Families passed down whispered stories of grandmothers who cried in their sleep, calling out names no one recognized. Communities developed elaborate rituals to protect their women during wartime, rituals born from the knowledge of what Ottoman conquest meant. The long-term effects were exactly what the Ottomans intended. Conquered populations remained submissive, not just from military defeat but from the deep psychological wounds inflicted on their social fabric. How do you rebel when your mother is married to your father's killer? How do you resist when your sister has borne children to the enemy? How do you maintain cultural identity when your very existence is proof of your people's defeat? Recent psychological studies of communities that were once under Ottoman rule have found patterns of inherited trauma that persist to this day. Families with documented histories of Ottoman conquest show higher rates of certain psychological disorders, relationship difficulties, and identity confusion. The empire didn't just conquer territories. It altered the psychological DNA of entire populations. But there's another layer to this story that's only now coming to light. In 2022, ground-penetrating radar at former Ottoman administrative sites revealed hidden chambers containing thousands of personal items, jewelry, letters, children's toys, family heirlooms, all carefully cataloged and stored. Why would the Ottomans preserve these items instead of destroying them? Newly translated documents suggest these belongings were used as psychological weapons. Years after conquest, women might be shown their children's toys to break them when other methods fail. They might be presented with family heirlooms as rewards for cooperation, only to have them taken away again for the slightest resistance. This collection of conquered people's belongings represents something even more sinister. The Ottoman Empire was creating an archive of human identity, a library of destroyed lives that could be weaponized at will. Each item was tagged with information about its owner, their fate, and how the item could be used for psychological manipulation. A child's doll might be used to convince a mother her daughter was still alive. A wedding ring might be shown to break a widow's resolve. A family Quran or Bible might be desecrated in front of its former owner to complete their psychological destruction. The discovery of these chambers has forced historians to reconsider the scale and sophistication of Ottoman psychological warfare. This wasn't just conquest and subjugation. This was the systematic cataloging and weaponization of human memory itself. The empire had created a technology of trauma that was centuries ahead of its time, a system for breaking and controlling human beings that would make modern totalitarian regimes envious. As we piece together these fragments of hidden history, disturbing patterns emerge. The Ottoman system for processing defeated warriors' wives appears to have influenced later genocides and ethnic cleansing campaigns. The techniques they perfected, family separation, identity erasure, forced cultural conversion, systematic rape, and psychological manipulation, appear again and again in history's darkest chapters. The Ottomans didn't just commit these atrocities. They created the playbook that others would follow. Documents from the Armenian genocide show Ottoman officials applying the same processing techniques they had refined over centuries. The systematic separation of women and children, the forced conversions, the calculated use of rape as a weapon of cultural destruction, all followed protocols established during the empire's expansion. The infrastructure of trauma was already in place, waiting to be activated. But perhaps the most chilling discovery comes from a set of documents found in 2021, hidden in what appeared to be a routine tax archive. These papers, written in coded Ottoman Turkish, describe something called Project Renewal, a late empire program aimed at studying the long-term effects of their psychological warfare techniques. Ottoman scholars were tracking families descended from processed women across multiple generations, documenting how trauma manifested in children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. They were studying their own cruelty with scientific detachment, treating human suffering as data points in a vast experiment. The project's findings, only partially translated so far, suggest that Ottomans understood generational trauma in ways we're only now beginning to grasp. They had documented how children of forced marriages showed specific behavioral patterns. how grandchildren exhibited identity confusion, even when raised entirely within Ottoman culture, how certain triggers could activate inherited trauma responses generations after the original trauma occurred. This wasn't just psychological warfare. It was psychological engineering on a generational scale. One particularly disturbing section describes what they called dormant resistance patterns, ways in which the descendants of processed women would unconsciously resist Ottoman culture, even while consciously embracing it. Women would teach their daughters songs. They didn't know the meaning of passing down fragments of erased cultures through generations. Men would experience unexplained anger when hearing certain Ottoman military music. Children would have nightmares about events they had never experienced, inherited memories of trauma encoded in their very beings. The Ottoman Empire fell in 1922, but the shadows it cast stretch into our present. In villages across the Balkans, elderly women still refuse to speak about their grandmothers' pasts. In Turkey, certain family names are known to descend from processed women, carrying a stigma that persists even today. In archives from Serbia to Syria, letters remain hidden in walls, testimonies of suffering that families are still afraid to acknowledge. The systematic nature of what the Ottomans did to defeated warriors' wives forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of conquest itself. This wasn't an aberration or excess of war. This was policy, refined and perfected over centuries, documented with bureaucratic precision, and implemented with industrial efficiency. The Ottoman Empire proved that you could destroy a people not through massacre, but through methodical psychological destruction, leaving them alive, but fundamentally broken. Modern psychologists studying inherited trauma have found that the effects of systematic psychological torture can persist for at least 7 generations. By that measure, the Ottoman Empire's program of psychological warfare is still claiming victims today. Families across the former Ottoman territories carry invisible wounds, struggling with depression, anxiety, and identity issues that trace back to ancestors they may not even know existed. The discovery of new documents continues to reveal the depth of this historical horror. In 2023, construction workers renovating a building in Belgrade found a cache of letters hidden in the foundation, written by women subjected to Ottoman processing. These letters describe experiences so harrowing that the Serbian government initially classified them, fearing their release might inflame ethnic tensions. When finally made public, they revealed new details about the Ottoman system, including the existence of special facilities where resistant women were subjected to what can only be described as psychological experimentation. One letter, written by a woman identified only as Katerina of Smederevo, describes being forced to watch as her infant son was raised by the Ottoman soldier who killed her husband, while she was required to serve as a wet nurse to the soldier's child by another woman. She writes, "They have created a hell where we are both dead and alive, where we must smile, while our hearts are screaming, where we must nurture the children of our destroyers, while our own children are turned against us. This is not conquest. This is the unmaking of the human soul." But the most shocking revelation may be that the Ottoman system didn't end with the empire itself. Documents suggest that in the chaos of the empire's dissolution, some of the techniques and even personnel from the processing programs were absorbed into other emerging nation-states. The expertise in psychological manipulation, the understanding of generational trauma, the bureaucratic mechanisms for human categorization and control. These didn't disappear. They evolved, adapted, and found new hosts. As we stand here, examining these fragments of suppressed history, we must ask ourselves, how many other systematic programs of human destruction remain hidden in archives around the world? How many victors have written histories that carefully omit their most calculated cruelties? And, perhaps, most disturbingly, how many of these techniques are still being refined and deployed today in conflicts we watch unfold on our screens? In refugee camps, where families are separated, in detention facilities, where identities are erased. The Ottoman Empire's treatment of defeated warriors' wives reveals a truth more terrifying than any individual atrocity, that human beings, given sufficient power and bureaucratic distance, can transform suffering into a science. They can create manuals for breaking spirits. They can establish quotas for destroyed lives. They can perfect techniques for trauma that echo through centuries. This is the history they didn't want you to know. Not because it makes the Ottoman Empire look barbaric. Many empires have been barbaric. But because it reveals the calculated, methodical nature of their cruelty. This wasn't the heat of battle or the chaos of conquest. This was policy, refined over centuries, documented in triplicate, and implemented with the same efficiency they used to collect taxes or build architectural wonders. As we close this dark chapter of hidden history, one final revelation haunts above all others. In the deepest archives of Istanbul, in documents that have only recently been examined, there are references to something called the Final Protocol. This was apparently a comprehensive plan, developed in the late Empire period, for the complete psychological transformation of all conquered populations. The fragments that survive suggest a program of such scope and sophistication that it would have made the processing of warriors' wives look primitive by comparison. The Final Protocol was never fully implemented. The empire fell before it could be deployed. But the documents that describe it read like a blueprint for the ultimate authoritarian state, one that controls not through force, but through the complete psychological dominance of its subjects. Techniques perfected on the wives of defeated warriors were to be applied to entire populations. Every citizen would be processed, categorized, and psychologically managed from birth to death. We may never know the full extent of what the Ottoman Empire did to the wives of defeated warriors. 2. Many documents remain untranslated. Too many victims took their stories to their graves. Too many descendants still live with the shame and silence that trauma creates. But what we do know is enough to force us to reconsider how we understand conquest, empire, and the human capacity for systematic cruelty. The women who suffered under this system were not just victims of war. They were subjects of a vast experiment in human destruction, one that treated their minds and souls as territories to be conquered. Their children and grandchildren inherited not just the trauma, but the confusion, the identity crisis, the deep psychological wounds that such systematic destruction creates. They became living monuments to the empire's power, walking reminders that Ottoman rule extended not just over land, but over the very essence of human identity. This is their story, finally told. The story of women whose names were erased, whose children were stolen, whose identities were systematically destroyed in service of imperial power. They suffered in silence, many taking their true names to their graves. But their suffering echoes through history, a warning about what happens when human beings become numbers in a bureaucratic system, when suffering becomes policy, when trauma becomes a tool of state control. The Ottoman Empire may be gone, but the questions it raises remain terrifyingly relevant. In an age of mass surveillance, psychological profiling, and algorithmic control, the techniques they pioneered seem less like ancient history and more like prophecy. The processing of defeated warriors' wives wasn't just a crime against those women. It was a crime against the very concept of human dignity, proof that Given enough power and bureaucratic distance, any atrocity can be systematized, documented, and refined. Remember these women. Remember their stolen names, their broken hearts, their children who never knew their true heritage. Remember that somewhere in dusty archives and hidden chambers, evidence of even greater horrors may still wait to be discovered. And remember that the capacity for such systematic cruelty didn't die with the Ottoman Empire. It waits, dormant, but never dead, for the next regime that believes human beings can be processed like raw materials in the machinery of power. What other empires have buried such systematic horrors in their histories? What other documents lie waiting in archives, too terrible to translate, too damaging to acknowledge? The Ottoman Empire's treatment of defeated warriors' wives may be one of history's most successfully hidden atrocities, but it certainly isn't the only one. The question that should haunt us all is simple. What else don't we know? If this dark chapter of hidden history has revealed anything, it's that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually surfaces. These women's stories, silenced for centuries, now speak to us across time, warning us about the human capacity for systematic evil and the importance of remembering those whose voices were stolen. Subscribe to uncover more forbidden history that was deliberately erased from your textbooks. Leave a comment with what shocked you most about this suppressed chapter of the past, because if we don't excavate these dark truths, we risk repeating them. The archives are opening, the translations are emerging, and the silence that protected history's greatest criminals is finally breaking. What will we discover next?